Welcome to Cafe Tales. Tonight we journey to St. Mary Mead in the early summer of 1934, where a charity cream tea in the vicarage garden becomes the scene of a shocking murder. When the village's most formidable widow collapses at her own donated silver service, poisoned, suspicion falls on her bitter stepchildren. But Jane Marple notices something the police have missed. The victim may not have been the intended target at all. Stay with us until the very end, for only Miss Marple's gentle wisdom can untangle the truth from the lies. Your support means the world to me. If you enjoy these stories and the work I do here, please consider subscribing to the channel. You can also join our membership for ad-free videos and exclusive mysteries. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. It's always fascinating to see where our detective community is gathered tonight. Now, settle in with a hot cup of tea. Stay curious, and let's unfold this mystery together. Chapter 1. An Invitation to Tea. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate shadows across her sitting room, where she had been enjoying a quiet breakfast of toast and marmalade. At precisely 9, as she was considering whether to begin her morning correspondence or tend to her roses, the garden gate creaked with its familiar protest, announcing a visitor. Miss Marple set down her teacup with the careful precision that had become second nature over her many years and peered through the window. Griselda Clement was making her way up the garden path with the particular urgency that suggested either great excitement or considerable distress. Given that it was a Tuesday morning in June and the vicar's wife was carrying what appeared to be a leather satchel, bulging with papers, Miss Marple suspected the former. "Oh, Miss Marple," Griselda called out breathlessly as she reached the yacht's front door. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you frightfully early, but I simply had to speak with you about the most marvelous idea." Miss Marple opened the door with a gentle smile, noting the flush of enthusiasm on the younger woman's face and the slight disarray of her usually immaculate hair. "My dear Griselda, you are never a disturbance. Please do come in. I was just about to put the kettle on for another cup of tea." "Oh, how perfectly lovely," Griselda exclaimed, following Miss Marple into the sitting room, where the morning light revealed the comfortable shabbiness of well-loved furniture and the subtle fragrance of roses drifting in from the garden. "I'm positively bursting with plans, and I simply must have your opinion on the matter." As Miss Marple busied herself with the familiar ritual of preparing tea, Griselda settled herself on the chintz-covered sofa and began extracting papers from her satchel with the enthusiasm of a child opening Christmas presents. "You see, Miss Marple, Leonard and I have been racking our brains about the church roof fund," Griselda began, referring to her husband, the Reverend Leonard Clement. "The estimates have come in, and I'm afraid the situation is rather more dire than we had anticipated. The roof simply must be repaired before the autumn rains, or we shall have services conducted under umbrellas." Miss Marple poured the tea with steady hands, her pale blue eyes attentive to every nuance of Griselda's animated explanation. She had observed over the years that when people were excited about their plans, they often revealed far more than they intended about the underlying complexities of any situation. "We considered the usual jumble sale, of course," Griselda continued, accepting her teacup gratefully. "But then the most wonderful idea struck me. What if we were to host a proper charity cream tea and garden fete, something rather elegant and inviting that would draw not only our dear villagers, but perhaps some of the weekend guests from the Blue Parrot as well?" "A charming idea," Miss Marple observed, settling into her favorite armchair. "The vicarage garden would provide a perfect setting for such an event." "Precisely." Griselda's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "And here is the truly exciting part. Mrs. Draycott has very generously offered to loan us her magnificent Georgian silver tea service. You know the one, Miss Marple? It belonged to her late husband's family and is absolutely exquisite. She says it would be her pleasure to contribute to such a worthy cause." Miss Marple's fingers paused almost imperceptibly as she lifted her teacup. Mrs. Draycott's generosity was indeed noteworthy, particularly given the rather strange circumstances that currently existed between the widow and various members of the village community. "How very kind of Mrs. Draycott," Miss Marple said mildly. "I trust she will be attending the event herself." "Oh, yes, indeed. She's quite looking forward to it, I believe. In fact, she's taken it upon herself to coordinate some of the arrangements with the other ladies." Griselda's expression grew slightly more complex. Of course, there are always delicate considerations when so many people are involved in organizing such an event. Miss Marple nodded with understanding. Village social dynamics were rather like a complicated piece of needlework. One pulled thread could affect the entire pattern. "I do hope," Griselda continued, her voice taking on a note of particular warmth, "that you would consider being one of our honored guests, Miss Marple. Your presence would lend such dignity to the occasion, and I know how much everyone values your company." "My dear, I should be delighted to attend," Miss Marple replied. "When is this festive occasion to take place?" "This coming Saturday afternoon, weather permitting. Mrs. Draycott suggested that we begin serving at 3 SIG, which should allow time for people to finish their luncheons and arrive in a properly receptive frame of mind for tea and conversation." After Griselda had departed with renewed vigor to continue her preparations, Miss Marple remained in her garden, deadheading roses with methodical care. The cottage garden was her sanctuary, a place where she could think clearly while her hands performed the familiar tasks of tending her beloved flowers. As she worked among the blooms, she reflected on the morning's conversation. Griselda's enthusiasm was genuine, and the cause was certainly worthy. Yet something in the younger woman's manner had suggested undercurrents that extended beyond the simple organization of a charity tea. The mention of Mrs. Draycott's silver service, the careful phrasing about delicate considerations, and the subtle tension that had flickered across Griselda's face when discussing the arrangements. All of these details settled into Miss Marple's mind like pieces of a puzzle awaiting assembly. She snipped a particularly lovely rose and held it to her nose, breathing in its sweet fragrance, while her mind wandered to recent village gossip. There had been whispers about Mrs. Draycott's stepchildren, something about disagreements over inheritance and family obligations. Then there were the new faces at the Blue Parrot, and the curious behavior of young Timothy Morse, the solicitor's clerk, who had been seen about the village asking rather pointed questions. Miss Marple smiled to herself as she made her way back. Toward the cottage, the cut roses cradled carefully in her arms. Village life had taught her that the most innocent social gatherings often revealed the most interesting aspects of human nature. A charity cream tea in aid of the church roof might prove to be considerably more eventful than anyone anticipated. Chapter 2. Gathering Clouds. Saturday morning dawned with the sort of crystalline perfection that seemed almost too good to be true. Miss Marple stood at her bedroom window, observing the cloudless sky with the mild satisfaction of one whose meteorological instincts had proved correct. She had awakened with the peculiar certainty that the day would be fine for the charity. Cream tea, though something in the quality of the morning light suggested that changes might be forthcoming before evening. After her usual breakfast of toast and tea, Miss Marple selected her second-best summer dress, a soft lavender creation that she reserved for occasions requiring both respectability and comfort. The charity fete would demand considerable sitting and observing, and experience had taught her that one's clothing should never interfere with one's ability to notice the important details of human behavior. The walk to the vicarage took her through the heart of St. Mary Mead, past the post office where Mrs. Bella was already arranging a display of picture postcards in the window, and the bakery from which emanated the heavenly aroma of fresh scones. Miss Marple nodded pleasantly to several villagers who were clearly making their way toward the same destination, noting with interest that even the most reluctant social participants seemed to have rallied for the cause of the church roof. The vicarage garden had been transformed into something approaching a fairyland. White cloths covered numerous small tables arranged beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak tree, while bunting in cheerful colors stretched between the garden, posts. The centerpiece of the arrangement was a long table positioned near the rose border, where Mrs. Draycott's celebrated Georgian silver gleamed in the morning sunlight with an almost regal splendor. "Miss Marple, how perfectly wonderful that you've arrived," called Griselda, hurrying across the lawn with the harried expression of a hostess who had discovered that organizing such an event involved considerably more details than she had initially anticipated. "I've reserved you a lovely spot at the table nearest the roses. You'll have a perfect view of everything from there." Miss Marple allowed herself to be guided to her designated position, a choice location that she recognized immediately would afford her excellent opportunities for observation. From this vantage point, she could see not only the main serving area, but also the various pathways that led to and from the vicarage, the garden gate, and the small side entrance that the household staff used for their comings and goings. As other guests began to arrive, Miss Marple settled herself comfortably and began the pleasant task of cataloging the attendees. Mrs. Bantry arrived in a flurry of silk scarves and enthusiastic greetings, followed closely by Colonel Bantry, who wore the resigned expression of a man who had learned that resistance to his wife's social commitments was futile. Dr. Haydock appeared shortly thereafter, his medical bag discreetly tucked beneath one of the serving tables, a practical precaution that Miss Marple noted with approval. The arrival of Mrs. Draycott herself created something of a stir. The widow swept into the garden wearing an elaborate hat adorned with artificial roses and the expression of proprietary satisfaction that suggested she considered herself the unofficial hostess of the entire event. She moved immediately to the silver service, adjusting the position of various pieces with the sort of fussiness that indicated both genuine pride and an underlying anxiety about maintaining proper standards. "Really, Griselda, dear," Mrs. Draycott announced in her caring voice, "I do think the teapot should be positioned more centrally, and perhaps the sugar bowl might be moved just a fraction to the left." Griselda agreed with the patient grace of someone who had learned that Mrs. Draycott's suggestions were more easily accommodated than argued with, and Miss Marple watched with interest as the arrangement was adjusted according to the older woman's specifications. The next arrivals provided considerably more dramatic interest. Margaret Forscott, Mrs. Draycott's stepdaughter, approached the garden with a sort of determined smile that suggested she was fulfilling an unpleasant obligation. She was a woman in her early 40s, dressed with careful attention to propriety, but without any particular flair for fashion. Her brother Robert followed several paces behind, his manner suggesting that he would greatly prefer to be elsewhere. Miss Marple observed the reunion between stepmother and stepchildren with the sort of fascination that one might reserve for a particularly intriguing stage performance. The exchange of pleasantries was accomplished with mechanical precision, but the underlying tension was as palpable as the scent of roses in the afternoon air. "How lovely that you could both attend," Mrs. Draycott declared, her voice carrying just a hint of surprise that suggested she had not entirely expected their appearance. "We wouldn't dream of missing such a worthy cause," Margaret replied smoothly, though her eyes remained carefully fixed on a point somewhere over her stepmother's left shoulder. Robert mumbled something that might have been agreement, and immediately moved toward the far end of the garden where he began an earnest examination of the vicar's prized delphiniums. Additional guests continued to arrive, including several weekend visitors from the Blue Parrot, who had been drawn by the prospect of authentic village hospitality. Miss Marple noted their presence with interest, particularly a distinguished gentleman with silvered hair, who seemed to know Mrs. Draycott and engaged her in what appeared to be a rather serious conversation near the garden gate. Of particular interest was the arrival of Mr. Pembridge, the elderly solicitor, accompanied by his young clerk, Timothy Morse. The older gentleman moved with the careful dignity of advanced years, while his companion seemed unusually nervous, frequently checking his pocket watch and glancing about the garden with the sort of alertness that suggested he was looking for someone in particular. The household staff moved efficiently among the tables, making final preparations for the serving of tea. Miss Marple observed them with the same attention she gave to the guests, noting that one of the younger maids, a girl she didn't immediately recognize, seemed particularly agitated, dropping a spoon twice and starting visibly when addressed by other members of the staff. As the afternoon settled into its established rhythm, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that the peaceful surface of the gathering concealed currents that ran considerably deeper than the simple desire to raise funds for church repairs. The quality of attention between various guests, the subtle tensions in seemingly casual conversations, and the general air of suppressed anxiety all suggested that the charity cream tea might prove to be considerably more eventful than anyone had anticipated. The first drops of rain began to fall just as the official serving time approached, though the clouds had gathered so gradually that their presence came as something of a surprise. Miss Marple glanced upward at the darkening sky and reflected that weather, like human nature, often provided the most interesting developments, just when one least expected them. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Garden. The official commencement of tea service proceeded with the sort of elaborate ceremony that Mrs. Draycott clearly believed such an occasion demanded. She had positioned herself at the head of the main table, presiding over her Georgian silver with the satisfaction of a general surveying a well-ordered battlefield. The teapots gleamed in the afternoon light. The sugar bowls reflected the surrounding. Roses and the cream jug stood in precise formation awaiting their moment of glory. Miss Marple accepted her cup of tea from Griselda with murmured thanks, noting that the young vicar's wife looked considerably more relaxed now that the event was properly underway. The initial flurry of arrivals had settled into the pleasant hum of village social interaction, punctuated by the gentle clink of silver spoons against delicate china, and the occasional appreciative comment about the excellence of the scones. From her advantageous position, Miss Marple found herself ideally situated to observe not only the main social gathering, but also the peripheral activities that often proved more illuminating than center stage performances. It was during her second cup of tea that she noticed the first incident that would later prove significant. The young maid whom she had observed earlier was moving between the tables with a tray of fresh cream jugs when she paused near the garden hedge that bordered the vicarage property. Sally, Miss Marple had heard her called, kept glancing toward the main gathering, as though concerned about being observed, while simultaneously appearing to wait for something or someone. A man in cycling attire appeared at the hedge, having apparently wheeled his bicycle along the lane behind the vicarage gardens. He was not a villager. Miss Marple was quite certain of that. The stranger was perhaps 40 years of age, lean and purposeful, moving with the manner of someone conducting urgent business rather than making a social call. The conversation between Sally and the cyclist was conducted in whispers that Miss Marple could not overhear, but their body language spoke clearly of distress. Sally shook her head repeatedly while the man's gestures grew increasingly emphatic. The encounter lasted perhaps 3 minutes, concluding with Sally accepting what appeared to be a small package from the stranger, which she immediately tucked into her apron pocket. The cyclist departed as quietly as he had arrived, wheeling his machine back down the lane until he disappeared from view. Sally remained by the hedge for several moments, her hand pressed to her apron pocket in obvious agitation before returning to her duties with determined normality. Miss Marple had barely finished processing this curious exchange when her attention was drawn to the second unusual incident of the afternoon. Timothy Morse, the solicitor's clerk, had been circulating among the tables with careful politeness, frequently scanning the gathered guests with an expression of mild anxiety. His search appeared to reach an alarming conclusion when his gaze fell upon a distinguished gentleman with silver hair seated at one of the far tables, one of the weekend guests from the Blue Parrot. The effect upon young Morse was immediate and dramatic. His face paled considerably, and he stood frozen for several seconds before moving with barely controlled panic toward Griselda. "Mrs. Clement," he said, his voice carrying a slight tremor, despite his efforts to appear composed. "I'm afraid I must apologize, but I have just remembered a rather urgent appointment. Please give my regrets to Mr. Pembridge." Before Griselda could respond with more than surprised acknowledgement, Timothy Morse had departed with unseemly haste, leaving behind a half-finished cup of tea and untouched refreshments. Miss Marple observed his retreat with considerable interest, noting that he took the longest possible route to avoid passing near the silver-haired gentleman's table. The third incident occurred approximately 20 minutes later, when Mrs. Draycott was approached by the same gentleman who had apparently precipitated young Morse's flight. The man moved with quiet confidence across the garden, exchanging pleasantries with other guests before reaching Mrs. Draycott's position. "Mrs. Draycott," he said, his voice carrying cultured tones that spoke of education and social standing. "I wonder if I might have a brief word about a matter of mutual interest." Mrs. Draycott's expression underwent a subtle transformation, shifting from gracious hostess to something approaching weariness. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, though her tone had notably cooled. Mr. Blackwood reached into his jacket and withdrew a sealed envelope, presenting it to Mrs. Draycott with a slight bow. "Perhaps this will refresh your memory," he said quietly. Mrs. Draycott accepted the envelope with visible reluctance, her fingers trembling as she broke the seal and withdrew a single sheet of paper. Miss Marple watched with fascination as the widow's face cycled through surprise, confusion, anger, and finally what appeared to be resignation mixed with fear. "I see," Mrs. Draycott said at length, her voice carefully controlled. "And what precisely do you expect me to do about this information?" "I expect nothing more than your cooperation in ensuring that certain arrangements proceed as planned," Mr. Blackwood replied smoothly. "I'm sure you understand the delicate nature of the situation." Mrs. Draycott folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her handbag. "I shall require some time to consider this matter properly," she said with as much dignity as she could muster. "Of course," Mr. Blackwood agreed, "though I trust you won't require too much time. Some opportunities have rather limited windows, if you understand my meaning." Following this exchange, Mr. Blackwood returned to his table with a satisfied air, while Mrs. Draycott remained at her position with obvious effort, her role as hostess requiring her to maintain appearances despite evident distress. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Draycott had begun displaying unusual restlessness. The widow, who had earlier been so particular about the precise arrangement of her precious silver service, now seemed unable to leave the tea things alone. She adjusted and readjusted the positions of cups and saucers, moved cream jugs from one location to another, and frequently rearranged the delicate balance of the entire display with nervous energy that spoke of considerable inner agitation. "Really," Mrs. Bantry observed from her nearby table, "you'll wear yourself to a shadow fussing with those tea things. Surely they're perfectly arranged as they are." "One simply cannot be too careful about proper service," Mrs. Draycott replied, with forced brightness, though her hands continued their restless adjustments. "Standards must be maintained, mustn't they?" Miss Marple sipped her tea and observed that Mrs. Draycott had now moved the cream jugs no fewer than 4 times, each relocation accompanied by increasingly nervous glances toward the table where Mr. Blackwood sat in apparently pleasant conversation with his fellow guests from the Blue Parrot. There was something almost compulsive about the widow's behavior, as though the act of rearranging the tea service provided some measure of control in circumstances that had clearly spiraled beyond her management. The weather was beginning to mirror the tensions Miss Marple had been observing throughout the afternoon. The clouds that had been gathering were now casting definite shadows across the garden, and there was a heaviness to the air that suggested the promised rain would not be long delayed. Several guests had begun glancing upward with the sort of concern that indicated they were weighing the social obligations of remaining against the practical considerations of avoiding a thorough soaking. "I do hope the weather holds," Griselda murmured, approaching Miss Marple's table with a fresh pot of tea. "Though I must say we've had a wonderful turnout despite the threatening sky." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, accepting the refill gratefully. "Village events do seem to bring out such interesting aspects of community spirit." Griselda smiled and moved on to attend to other guests, leaving Miss Marple to continue her quiet observations. The afternoon had provided her with a most intriguing collection of incidents, each seemingly unrelated, but collectively suggesting that the peaceful surface of the charity tea concealed currents of considerable complexity. Sally continued her duties with determined efficiency, though Miss Marple noticed that the girl's hand frequently strayed to her apron pocket, where the mysterious package lay concealed. Timothy Morse's hasty departure had left Mr. Pembridge looking somewhat bewildered and concerned about his clerk's sudden indisposition. Mrs. Draycott's restless rearrangement of the tea service continued unabated, creating an almost hypnotic pattern of nervous movement that seemed to increase rather than decrease her obvious agitation. The first drops of rain began to fall just as Miss Marple was finishing her third cup of tea, fat droplets that splashed onto the white tablecloths, and sent several ladies reaching for their parasols with practiced efficiency. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon was finally preparing to make its presence known, and Miss Marple reflected that the timing seemed almost theatrically appropriate for the conclusion of such an eventful social gathering. She gazed across the garden at the assembled company, noting the various expressions of satisfaction, concern, and barely concealed anxiety that played across different faces, and felt the familiar stirring of curiosity that invariably accompanied her encounters with the more puzzling aspects of human nature. The charity cream tea had certainly achieved its stated purpose of bringing the community together, though Miss Marple suspected that the bonds being forged this afternoon might prove to be considerably more complex and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Chapter 4. Death Comes to Tea. The threatened rain had begun in earnest, though the ancient oak tree provided sufficient shelter for the main gathering to continue with only minor adjustments. Several ladies had opened their parasols as protection against the increasingly persistent droplets, while others had moved their chairs closer to the table to take advantage of the natural canopy overhead. The atmosphere had taken on an almost intimate quality, as though the weather had drawn the company together in defiance of the elements. Miss Marple had accepted another cup of tea and was enjoying a particularly excellent scone when she noticed that Mrs. Draycott had finally settled into what appeared to be her preferred arrangement of the tea service. The Georgian silver had been positioned and repositioned so many times throughout the afternoon that Miss Marple had begun to wonder if the widow would ever achieve satisfaction with the display. Now, however, Mrs. Draycott seemed to have reached some sort of resolution, seating herself with obvious relief at the head of the table. "There," Mrs. Draycott announced with satisfaction, surveying her handiwork. "I do believe we have everything properly arranged at last. Nothing quite compares to the elegance of proper Georgian silver. Wouldn't you agree, Miss Marple?" "It is indeed a beautiful service," Miss Marple replied diplomatically, noting that Mrs. Draycott's hands still trembled slightly as she lifted her own teacup. The events of the afternoon had clearly taken their toll on the widow's composure, despite her determined efforts to maintain the appearance of gracious hostess. The conversation at the various tables had taken on the comfortable rhythm that typically characterized the latter stages of a successful social gathering. Colonel Bantry was regaling Dr. Haydock with reminiscences of his military service, while Mrs. Bantry had engaged several other ladies in animated discussion about the merits of various gardening techniques. The weekend guests from the Blue Parrot appeared to be enjoying themselves considerably, with Mr. Blackwood contributing occasional remarks that suggested both wit and extensive travel experience. It was at this moment of apparent tranquility that the afternoon took its shocking and tragic turn. Mrs. Draycott had been spreading clotted cream on a fresh scone with evident pleasure, commenting to her immediate neighbors about the excellence of the local dairy products, when she suddenly paused mid-sentence. Her face took on an expression of mild confusion, as though she had encountered something unexpected. "Oh," she said, softly, one hand moving to her throat. "How very odd. I seem to be—" The words died away as her expression shifted from confusion to alarm. The scone fell from her fingers onto the pristine tablecloth, scattering crumbs across the Georgian silver. Her breathing became labored, and she clutched at her throat with both hands. "Mrs. Draycott," Griselda inquired with immediate concern, rising from her position at a nearby table. "Are you quite all right?" Mrs. Draycott attempted to respond, but managed only a strangled sound that suggested considerable distress. Her face had begun to take on an alarming pallor, and she swayed in her chair as though fighting to maintain her equilibrium. Miss Marple was on her feet almost instantly, her years of village experience having taught her to recognize the signs of genuine medical emergency. "Dr. Haydock," she called sharply, her voice cutting through the concerned murmur that had begun to rise from the assembled guests. "I believe your assistance is urgently required," Dr. Haydock responded with the swift efficiency of long practice, reaching Mrs. Draycott's side just as she began to collapse forward onto the table. The impact sent teacups flying and created a cascade of silver that clattered onto the ground with shocking violence. The Georgian cream jug overturned, sending its contents spreading across the white tablecloth in an irregular stain that seemed almost accusatory in its stark prominence. "Everyone, please stand back," Dr. Haydock commanded, his professional authority immediately apparent as he caught Mrs. Draycott before she could fall completely. "Give me room to examine her properly." The assembled guests complied with varying degrees of reluctance, some retreating to safer distances, while others pressed closer with the sort of morbid curiosity that tragedy inevitably inspires. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe both the medical emergency and the reactions of the surrounding company, her instincts already suggesting that this incident might prove to be considerably more complex than a simple medical collapse. Dr. Haydock worked with swift competence, checking Mrs. Draycott's pulse and breathing while examining her face and eyes with the sort of focused attention that spoke of serious concern. His expression grew increasingly grave as his examination proceeded, and Miss Marple noted that he paid particular attention to the widow's throat and the area around her mouth. "Is she choking?" Griselda asked anxiously, wringing her hands as she watched the proceedings. "Perhaps something caught in her throat." Dr. Haydock did not immediately respond, his attention focused entirely on his patient. Mrs. Draycott's breathing had become increasingly irregular, and her complexion had taken on a distinctly bluish tinge that suggested serious respiratory distress. The doctor's efforts to revive her grew more urgent, but it became increasingly apparent that his ministrations were proving ineffective. "I'm afraid," Dr. Haydock said at length, his voice heavy with regret, "that Mrs. Draycott has passed away." The announcement created an immediate sensation among the assembled guests. Several ladies gasped audibly, while others began speaking in hushed, horrified tones about the shock and tragedy of such an unexpected death. Colonel Bantry immediately moved to comfort his wife, who had begun crying softly into her handkerchief, while the weekend guests from the Blue Parrot exchanged glances that suggested considerable unease about finding themselves involved in such an incident. Miss Marple remained silent, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. She noted the position of Mrs. Draycott's body, the scattered silver, the overturned cream jug, and the various expressions of shock, grief, and what might have been something else entirely on the faces of the surrounding guests. Her instincts, honed by years of observation and experience, were already suggesting that this tragedy might not be the simple medical emergency it appeared to be. Dr. Haydock continued his examination with professional thoroughness, his expression growing increasingly troubled as he proceeded. "Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple said quietly, moving closer so that her words would not carry to the other guests, "might I inquire whether you suspect something other than natural causes?" The doctor glanced up at her with an expression that suggested both surprise and relief at her perceptive question. "I'm afraid," he said in low tones, "that Mrs. Draycott's symptoms are not entirely consistent with choking or any obvious medical condition. The dilation of her pupils, the particular coloration of her skin, and certain other factors suggest that she may have been poisoned." The word seemed to hang in the air between them like a physical presence. Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring of intellectual challenge that always accompanied her encounters with the darker aspects of human nature, while simultaneously experiencing genuine sorrow for the loss of a fellow villager, however difficult Mrs. Draycott might have been in life. "Poisoned," she repeated quietly, though without any real surprise. The events of the afternoon had been building toward some sort of crisis, and this tragic conclusion seemed almost inevitable in retrospect. "I believe," Dr. Haydock continued, still speaking in tones meant only for Miss Marple's ears, "that the symptoms suggest digitalis poisoning. The cardiac effects, the breathing difficulties, the particular progression of symptoms, all are consistent with that particular toxin." Miss Marple nodded gravely, her mind already beginning to process the implications of this diagnosis. Digitalis was not an exotic poison requiring elaborate preparation or specialized knowledge. It occurred naturally in foxgloves, which grew wild throughout the countryside and were commonly cultivated in village gardens. Anyone with basic botanical knowledge could have obtained and prepared it without great difficulty. "I believe," she said quietly to Dr. Haydock, "that Inspector Slack should be summoned immediately. This is no longer a matter for medical attention alone." Dr. Haydock agreed with evident reluctance, clearly wishing that such measures were not necessary, but recognizing their inevitability. As he moved away to make the necessary telephone call, Miss Marple remained by Mrs. Draycott's body, her eyes taking in every detail of the scene, while her mind began the complex process of analysis that had served her so well in previous encounters with violent death. The charity cream tea had achieved its purpose of bringing the community together, though in a manner that none of the organizers could possibly have anticipated. Miss Marple reflected grimly that village life, however peaceful it might appear on the surface, had once again demonstrated its capacity for producing the most shocking and tragic surprises. Chapter 5. Motives and Suspicions. Inspector Slack arrived at the vicarage with his usual air of barely contained irritation, as though the inconvenience of a murder investigation during what should have been a peaceful Saturday afternoon was a personal affront to his sense of order. He was a compact man with sharp features and an unfortunate tendency to assume that the most obvious explanation was invariably the correct one, a characteristic that Miss Marple had observed to be both his greatest weakness and, occasionally, his unexpected strength. "Well, then," he announced briskly, surveying the scene with the sort of professional assessment that suggested he had already formed preliminary conclusions. "What have we here?" Dr. Haydock provided a concise medical summary while Inspector Slack examined Mrs. Draycott's body with punctilious attention. The rain had intensified, forcing the remaining guests to take shelter in the vicarage drawing room, where they sat in uncomfortable silence, punctuated by nervous whispers and the occasional sob from those most affected by the tragedy. "Digitalis? Poisoning, you say?" Inspector Slack mused, making notes in his official notebook with the sort of deliberate precision that suggested he was already constructing his case. "Foxglove, most likely. Common enough plant here." Miss Marple, who had positioned herself near enough to observe the proceedings without appearing to interfere, noted that the inspector's attention had immediately focused on Margaret and Robert Forscott. The stepchildren stood together near the French doors leading to the garden, their expressions carefully composed, but their body language speaking clearly of considerable strain. "Now then," Inspector Slack continued, turning his attention to the assembled company, "I'll need to speak with each of you individually, but first I'd like to establish the basic facts. Mrs. Draycott was in apparent good health when she arrived this afternoon." "Oh, yes," Griselda confirmed, though her voice trembled slightly. She seemed quite her usual self, if perhaps a little more energetic than usual about arranging the tea service. "And who had access to her food and drink?" Inspector Slack inquired, his gaze sweeping across the group with particular attention to the family members present. Miss Marple observed this initial questioning with the sort of detached interest that came from long experience with Inspector Slack's methodology. She noted that Margaret Forscott had gone quite pale when the inspector's eyes rested on her, while her brother Robert seemed to be making a determined effort to appear completely calm. The inspector's first formal interview was with Margaret, conducted in the vicar's study, while the other guests remained in the drawing room under the watchful eye of Constable Fletcher. Miss Marple, who had taken a position near the window where she could observe the garden while appearing to rest quietly, found herself in a perfect location to overhear the occasional raised voice from the study. "Your relationship with your stepmother was not entirely harmonious, I understand," came Inspector Slack's voice through the partially open door. "Family relationships are always complex," Margaret replied, her tone carefully measured. "Georgina could be difficult at times, but I certainly bore her no ill will." "Yet there was the matter of your husband's business difficulties, was there not, and your stepmother's recent changes to her will?" A longer pause followed this question, and Miss Marple could imagine Margaret struggling to find words that would not further incriminate her. When the response came, it carried a note of desperation that had not been present earlier. "My husband's business concerns are hardly unique in these difficult times," Margaret said. "And as for Georgina's will, I am sure I have no idea what arrangements she may have made." When Robert's turn came for questioning, his voice carried through the study door with equal clarity, though his manner seemed more aggressive than his sister's defensive approach. "Look here, Inspector," he said with obvious annoyance. "I won't pretend that Georgina and I saw eye to eye on everything, but the idea that I would poison her is absolutely ridiculous. Yet you did have a rather public quarrel with her just last month, didn't you? Something about gambling debts and your allowance being discontinued." "A family disagreement, nothing more," Robert replied stiffly. "Hardly grounds for murder, Miss—" Marple reflected that both stepchildren were responding exactly as guilty parties might be expected to respond, which in her experience often meant they were entirely innocent. Truly guilty individuals frequently displayed either excessive cooperation or elaborate explanations that revealed more than they concealed. Following the formal interviews, Inspector Slack emerged from the study with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he had made significant progress in his investigation. He approached Miss Marple with the sort of grudging respect that their previous encounters had taught him to maintain. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, settling into a nearby chair, "what's your impression of this business?" "It's certainly a tragic end to what should have been a pleasant afternoon," Miss Marple replied, mildly. "Though I confess I found myself rather puzzled by certain aspects of the events." Miss Marple considered her response carefully, knowing that Inspector Slack's initial assumptions could sometimes be difficult to dislodge once firmly established. "I noticed that Mrs. Draycott seemed particularly agitated throughout the afternoon, even before the tragic conclusion. And there was the matter of young Timothy Morse's rather sudden departure." Inspector Slack's expression sharpened with interest. "The solicitor's clerk. What about him?" "He left quite abruptly after spotting one of the weekend guests from the Blue Parrot," Miss Marple explained. "A Mr. Blackwood, I believe. The young man seemed quite distressed by something." This information clearly caught Inspector Slack's attention, and he made additional notes with renewed energy. Miss Marple was pleased to see that he was at least considering possibilities beyond the obvious family suspects, though she suspected his ultimate conclusions might still prove somewhat hasty. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Pembridge, the elderly solicitor, who had been summoned by Constable Fletcher to discuss his clerk's unusual behavior. The old gentleman appeared genuinely bewildered by the afternoon's events, and particularly concerned about Timothy Morse's whereabouts. "Most irregular behavior," Mr. Pembridge insisted, settling heavily into a chair with obvious fatigue. "Timothy has always been a most reliable young man. I cannot imagine what could have prompted such an abrupt departure." "Had he been asking questions about Mrs. Draycott's affairs recently?" Inspector Slack inquired. Mr. Pembridge's expression grew troubled. "Well, yes. As a matter of fact, he had been reviewing some of her financial arrangements. Nothing unusual. In that, you understand? Simply routine administrative matters." Miss Marple observed that Mr. Pembridge's explanation carried a note of defensiveness that suggested the matters might not have been as routine as he claimed. She made a mental note to inquire more deeply into Timothy Morse's recent activities when the opportunity presented itself. The afternoon was drawing to a close, and the remaining guests were beginning to make their departures with the sort of subdued efficiency the tragedy inevitably imposed on social gatherings. The weekend visitors from the Blue Parrot were among the first to leave, though Miss Marple noted that Mr. Blackwood seemed in no particular hurry despite the circumstances. As Inspector Slack concluded his preliminary investigation and arrangements were made for Mrs. Draycott's body to be removed, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that the obvious suspects might not be the correct ones. The afternoon had provided her with a collection of curious incidents and revealing behaviors that suggested a considerably more complex situation than a simple case of family resentment leading to murder. The rain continued to fall steadily as the last of the guests departed, leaving the vicarage garden looking forlorn and abandoned. The white tablecloths lay sodden and stained. The Georgian silver had been removed as evidence, and the scattered remains of what should have been a triumphant charity event bore mute testimony to the unpredictable nature of village life. Monsieur Marple made her way home through the gathering dusk, her mind already working on the puzzle that Inspector Slack's conventional approach might well fail to solve. Chapter 6. Village Parallels. Sunday morning arrived with the sort of crystalline clarity that often follows a heavy rain, as though the storm had washed the world clean and left it gleaming in the early sunlight. Miss Marple attended the morning service at St. Mary Mead's Parish Church, where the Reverend Leonard Clement delivered a particularly moving sermon about the fragility of life and the importance of charity in all its forms. The congregation was notably subdued, with many seats that would normally have been occupied by Mrs. Draycott and her circle remaining conspicuously empty. Following the service, Miss Marple found herself approached by several villagers eager to discuss the previous day's tragedy. Village life, she had long observed, possessed an almost gravitational pull toward dramatic events, drawing people together in shared speculation and mutual concern. "Such a dreadful business," murmured Mrs. Price Ridley, the village's most dedicated gossip, as she fell into step beside Miss Marple on the path leading from the churchyard. To think that poor Mrs. Draycott should meet such an end at what should have been a pleasant social gathering. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed mildly, though her attention was focused on the small group gathered near the church gate, where she could see Inspector Slack in earnest conversation with Constable Fletcher. "I suppose it must have been those stepchildren of hers," Mrs. Price Ridley continued, with the sort of certainty that suggested she had already tried and convicted the suspects in her own mind. "Money troubles, you know. There's nothing quite like inheritance disputes to bring out the worst in people." Miss Marple made appropriate murmurs of acknowledgement while reflecting that Mrs. Price Ridley's conclusions were precisely what one might expect from someone who preferred simple explanations to complex realities. In her experience, the most obvious suspects were often the least likely to be guilty, particularly when their motives were so transparent that even casual observers could identify them. As she made her way home through the village, Miss Marple found her thoughts returning to a particular incident from several years earlier that bore curious similarities to the current situation. Old Mr. Carmichael, who had run the village bakery before his retirement, had been involved in what initially appeared to be a simple case of food poisoning affecting several customers. The investigation had eventually revealed that a dishonest supplier had been using cream deliveries to transport contraband, adulterating the legitimate products with various substances to mask the illegal cargo. The parallel was not exact, but something about the mechanism of that earlier crime, the use of a common, trusted delivery system to conceal harmful substances, seemed relevant to Mrs. Draycott's death. Miss Marple had observed the careful arrangement and rearrangement of the cream jugs throughout the afternoon, and she found herself wondering whether the poison had been introduced through a similar method of concealment. Her contemplations were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, who appeared at her garden gate with the sort of determined expression that suggested he had specific matters to discuss. "Miss Marple," he called out, "might I have a word? There are certain aspects of yesterday's tragedy that I believe would benefit from your particular insights." Miss Marple welcomed him into her sitting room where she prepared tea with the sort of automatic efficiency that freed her mind for more important considerations. "I've been thinking about the poison," Dr. Haydock began without preamble. "Digitalis is not difficult to obtain or prepare, but the method of administration puzzles me considerably." "In what way?" Miss Marple inquired, settling into her favorite chair with her knitting basket conveniently at hand. "The symptoms appeared very quickly after Mrs. Draycott began eating her scone with cream," Dr. Haydock explained. "Yet digitalis poisoning typically requires a larger dose than could easily be concealed in a single portion of food without affecting the taste noticeably." Miss Marple's needles began their familiar rhythm as she considered this information. "You suspect, then, that the poison was administered in a more concentrated form?" "Precisely, and that suggests someone with more sophisticated knowledge than the average village resident might possess." Dr. Haydock paused to accept his teacup gratefully. "Which makes me rather skeptical of Inspector Slack's focus on the family members." "Have you shared these concerns with the inspector?" Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Dr. Haydock's expression suggested considerable frustration. "I've attempted to, but he seems quite convinced that he has identified the culprits. He's planning to make arrests this afternoon, I believe." This news alarmed Miss Marple considerably. In her experience, premature arrests often resulted in the real criminals escaping justice, while innocent people suffered for crimes they had not committed. "Dr. Haydock," she said carefully, "you mentioned that Timothy Morse seemed particularly agitated yesterday. Have there been any attempts to locate him?" "Constable Fletcher went to his lodgings this morning, but the landlady reported that he had packed his belongings and departed late yesterday evening. No forwarding address, apparently." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythm. Timothy Morse's flight was certainly suspicious, but it might equally well indicate fear rather than guilt. His hasty departure upon seeing Mr. Blackwood, combined with his current absence, suggested that he possessed knowledge that made him feel threatened rather than culpable. "I find myself wondering," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "about the nature of young Timothy's recent inquiries into Mrs. Draycott's affairs. Mr. Pembridge seemed rather defensive when the matter was raised yesterday." Dr. Haydock's expression sharpened with interest. "You suspect irregularities in the financial arrangements?" "I suspect," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that Timothy may have discovered something that placed him in considerable danger. His behavior yesterday suggested fear rather than guilt, and his subsequent disappearance supports that interpretation." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of voices from the lane, and Miss Marple recognized Inspector Slack's authoritative tones directing what appeared to be official business. A glance through the window confirmed her suspicions. The inspector was leading a small party that included both Margaret and Robert Forscott, clearly under arrest. "Oh dear," Miss Marple murmured, observing the procession with genuine distress. "I do hope the inspector is not making a serious mistake." Dr. Haydock joined her at the window, his expression reflecting similar concern. "Those poor young people, whatever their faults, I find it difficult to believe they're capable of cold-blooded murder." Miss Marple returned to her knitting with renewed determination. The arrest of the stepchildren would undoubtedly satisfy public demand for swift justice, but she was increasingly convinced that the real truth lay elsewhere. The mysterious package delivered to Sally, Timothy Morse's frightened flight, and Mr. Blackwood's enigmatic conversation with Mrs. Draycott all suggested a considerably more complex situation than Inspector Slack's straightforward interpretation would accommodate. As Dr. Haydock took his leave, Miss Marple reflected on the various threads of information she had gathered. The pattern reminded her strongly of the old bakery incident, where the obvious explanation had concealed a more sophisticated criminal enterprise. In that case, the guilty parties had been those who appeared most helpful and cooperative, while the true victims had been dismissed as unreliable witnesses. She settled more comfortably into her chair and allowed her mind to wander over the events of the previous afternoon, paying particular attention to those moments when her instincts had suggested that appearances might be deceiving. village life had taught her that the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood how to manipulate social expectations and conventional assumptions to their own advantage. The afternoon sun streamed through her sitting room windows, illuminating the peaceful domesticity of her surroundings while her thoughts pursued considerably darker channels. Somewhere in the seemingly innocent events of the charity cream tea lay the key to Mrs. Draycott's murder, and Miss Marple was increasingly certain that Key had nothing to do with family disputes or inheritance quarrels. Chapter 7. The Wrong Cup, Monday. Morning brought Miss Marple an unexpected visitor in the form of Sally Fletcher, the young maid who had served at the charity tea. The girl appeared at Miss Marple's garden gate shortly after breakfast, her face bearing the unmistakable signs of a sleepless night and considerable inner turmoil. "Miss Marple," Sally said hesitantly, wringing her hands as she approached the cottage door. "Might I speak with you? I don't know what to do, and everyone says you're very wise about such matters." Miss Marple welcomed the girl into her sitting room with gentle kindness, noting the nervous energy that seemed to radiate from her slight frame. Sally perched on the edge of the offered chair as though prepared for immediate flight, her eyes darting constantly toward the windows as if she feared being observed. "My dear child," Miss Marple said softly, pouring tea with steady hands, "you appear greatly troubled. Perhaps it would help to share whatever is causing you such distress." Sally accepted the teacup with trembling fingers, though she made no attempt to drink from it. "It's about Saturday afternoon, Miss Marple. About what happened to poor Mrs. Draycott. I'm afraid I may have done something terrible without meaning to." Miss Marple settled into her chair with her knitting, the familiar rhythm of the needles often having a calming effect on agitated visitors. "Suppose you tell me exactly what occurred from the beginning." The story that emerged was both illuminating and deeply troubling. Sally had indeed received specific instructions about the placement of certain cream jugs, though she hadn't understood the sinister purpose behind those directions at the time. "A gentleman approached me last week," Sally explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said he was a friend of Mr. Pembridge's, and that there was to be a special surprise for one of the guests at the tea. He gave me a particular cream jug and told me to place it at a specific table when the time came." "And did you recognize this gentleman?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "I had seen him about the village, though I didn't know his name then. He had cycling clothes and seemed very respectable. He said it was meant to be a harmless joke, something about surprising someone who had been asking too many questions." Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm while her mind processed this crucial information. The mysterious cyclists. Instructions had clearly been meant to target someone other than Mrs. Draycott, and Sally's innocent compliance had made her an unwitting accomplice in a murder plot. "Can you remember exactly where you were told to place this special cream jug?" Miss Marple asked. Sally nodded miserably. "At the table nearest the garden gate where young Mr. Morse was supposed to sit, but he never came to that table, did he? He left early, and Mrs. Draycott kept moving things about so much that I lost track of where everything ended up." The picture was becoming clearer with each revelation. Timothy Morse had been the intended victim, not Mrs. Draycott. His flight from the tea upon seeing Mr. Blackwood had saved his life, but Mrs. Draycott's compulsive rearrangement of the tea service had sealed her own fate. "Sally," Miss Marple said carefully, "I believe you must tell Inspector Slack about this immediately. You are not guilty of any intentional wrongdoing, but this information is vital to preventing an innocent family from suffering for crimes they did not commit." The girl's face crumpled with relief and renewed fear in equal measure. "But what if they don't believe me? What if they think I meant to hurt Mrs. Draycott?" Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded Sally with the sort of gentle authority that had reassured countless troubled souls over the years. "The truth has a way of making itself known. My dear, Inspector Slack may be hasty in his conclusions, but he is fundamentally honest. When presented with evidence, he will act upon it appropriately." After Sally's departure, Miss Marple remained in her sitting room for some time, piecing together the implications of what she had learned. The intended victim had been Timothy Morse, who had clearly discovered something incriminating about Mr. Pembridge's handling of Mrs. Draycott's affairs. The solicitor, faced with exposure and ruin, had arranged for his clerk to be silenced permanently. The method was both clever and cowardly, using an innocent servant to deliver the poison while maintaining complete deniability. The charity tea had provided perfect cover, as the confusion of multiple tables and the social expectation of sharing refreshments would have made it nearly impossible to trace the source of the poison cream. Mrs. Draycott's death had been a tragic accident, the result of her own meddlesome nature and the killer's failure to account for her compulsive rearrangement of the tea service. Mr. Pembridge had succeeded in silencing his clerk's discoveries, but at the cost of an entirely innocent victim. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to her writing desk, where she began composing a careful letter to Inspector Slack. The evidence was largely circumstantial, but when combined with Sally's testimony and Timothy Morse's suspicious disappearance, it painted a convincing picture of the real events. She paused in her writing to consider the psychological aspects of the case. Mr. Pembridge had presented himself as a pillar of respectability, using his professional reputation and advanced age to deflect suspicion. The choice of digitalis as a poison suggested someone with botanical knowledge, not uncommon among country solicitors who often maintained extensive gardens. The letter completed, Miss Marple sealed it carefully and prepared to deliver it personally to Inspector Slack. She suspected that the revelation would come as an unwelcome surprise to the inspector, who had invested considerable professional pride in his swift arrest of the stepchildren. However, she was confident that his fundamental sense of justice would ultimately prevail over his wounded ego. As she walked through the village toward the police station, Miss Marple reflected on the cruel irony of the situation. Mrs. Draycott, for all her faults, had died because of her very human desire to maintain proper standards and control her environment. Her compulsive rearrangement of the tea service, the behavior that had annoyed so many people during her lifetime, had ultimately cost her her life. The afternoon was drawing to a close as Miss Marple made her way home, having delivered both her letter and Sally's reluctant testimony to Inspector Slack. The wheels of justice would now begin their slow but inexorable turn, and she was confident that the truth would eventually prevail. Timothy Morse remained missing, but she suspected that once news of the real killer's arrest becomes public, the frightened young man will find the courage to return and clear his name. Village life will eventually return to its normal rhythm, though the charity cream tea will undoubtedly be remembered as one of the more dramatic social events in St. Mary Mead's recent history. Miss Marple settled into her evening routine with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had helped prevent a serious miscarriage of justice, while reflecting once again on the endlessly fascinating complexity of human nature. Chapter 8. Truth over Tea. The vicarage drawing room had been transformed, once again, though this time for a considerably more serious purpose than social entertainment. Inspector Slack had assembled the key participants in Saturday's tragedy, along with several additional figures whose involvement had only recently become apparent. Miss Marple sat quietly near the window, her knitting basket at her side, observing the assembled company with the sort of gentle attention that masked her acute awareness of every nuance and detail. Margaret and Robert Forscott occupied chairs near the fireplace, their expressions bearing the haggard marks of 2 nights spent in police custody. Mr. Pembridge sat with the rigid dignity of advanced years, though Miss Marple noted that his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his spectacles. Sally Fletcher stood near the door, flanked by Constable Fletcher, her testimony having precipitated this gathering. "Ladies and gentlemen," Inspector Slack began with the sort of formal authority that indicated he was prepared to admit previous errors in judgment. "New evidence has come to light regarding the death of Mrs. Draycott. Miss Marple has been instrumental in uncovering certain facts that necessitate a complete reconsideration of this case." Miss Marple acknowledged this introduction with a modest nod, then set aside her knitting and rose to address the assembly. Thank you, Inspector. I believe it would be helpful to begin with a small incident from several years ago that bears remarkable similarity to our current situation. She proceeded to describe the case of Mr. Carmichael's bakery, where a dishonest supplier had used cream deliveries to transport contraband goods. The parallel became clear to me when I observed the careful attention paid to the placement of cream jugs throughout Saturday afternoon, and when young Sally courageously came forward with her testimony. Sally shifted uncomfortably under the attention of the group, but maintained her composure as Miss Marple continued. Sally was approached by a man in cycling clothes who convinced her to place a particular cream jug at a specific table. She was told it was meant as a harmless surprise for someone who had been asking too many questions. "This is preposterous," Mr. Pembridge interjected, his voice carrying a note of outraged dignity. "Are you suggesting that I would involve myself in such a sordid affair?" Miss Marple regarded the elderly solicitor with patient understanding. "I'm afraid the evidence suggests precisely that, Mr. Pembridge. Timothy Morse had discovered irregularities in your handling of Mrs. Draycott's accounts, had he not? Embezzlement on a scale that would have meant professional ruin and criminal prosecution." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Mr. Pembridge's face had gone quite pale, though he maintained his posture of affronted innocence. Young Morse was inexperienced and prone to misunderstanding complex financial arrangements. Any irregularities were merely administrative oversights. "I think not," Miss Marple replied gently but firmly. Timothy's behavior on Saturday afternoon, his nervous scanning of the guests, his panicked flight upon seeing Mr. Blackwood, all suggested someone who had uncovered dangerous knowledge and found himself face to face with his own destruction. Inspector Slack leaned forward with obvious interest. "And who exactly is this Mr. Blackwood?" "An associate of Mr. Pembridge, I believe," Miss Marple continued, "brought in to handle the more delicate aspects of silencing Timothy's discoveries. The cycling clothes provided perfect anonymity for approaching Sally, while the charity tea offered ideal circumstances for the crime." She turned her attention to the assembled group, her voice taking on the gentle but inexorable tone that had characterized her previous expositions of criminal behavior. "The plan was elegantly simple. Timothy would consume the poison cream and die apparently of natural causes during a crowded social event. The confusion of multiple tables and shared refreshments would make investigation nearly impossible." "But something went wrong," Margaret Forscott said quietly, speaking for the first time since the gathering had begun. "Indeed," Miss Marple confirmed. "Two things went wrong, in fact. First, Timothy recognized Mr. Blackwood among the guests and fled before he could be served the intended refreshments. Second, and more tragically, Mrs. Draycott's compulsive rearrangement of the tea service resulted in the poison cream being moved to her own table." The room fell silent as the implications of this revelation settled over the assembled company. Mrs. Draycott's death had been entirely accidental, the result of her own meddlesome nature and the killer's failure to account for human unpredictability. "The irony," Miss Marple observed with gentle sadness, "is that Mrs. Draycott died because of the very behavior that had made her so difficult to deal with during her lifetime. Her insistence on proper arrangements and her inability to leave well enough alone ultimately sealed her fate." Mr. Pembridge had begun to show signs of collapse, his carefully maintained dignity crumbling under the weight of exposure. "I never intended— Mrs. Draycott was not supposed to—" "No," Miss Marple agreed compassionately. "I'm quite sure you never intended to harm Mrs. Draycott, but you were perfectly willing to murder young Timothy Morse to protect your criminal activities. The fact that you killed the wrong person through miscalculation does not diminish the evil of your intent." Inspector Slack had been taking careful notes throughout Miss Marple's explanation, and now he looked up with the sort of grim satisfaction that came from seeing justice properly served. "Mr. Pembridge, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Mrs. Georgina Draycott and the attempted murder of Timothy Morse."